I was raised by a single mom in trailer parks all over the southern Ozarks, and while it definitely wasn't a childhood I'd want for my own kids, I can't say my mom didn't try. In fact, she did a fine job. She worked her butt off to keep a roof over our heads and food on our table, and aside from a few isolated incidents, I'd say the vast majority of my younger years were very happy ones. But there's this one thing that really stands out to me. From back when I was in 3rd grade, and it kept me up at night for weeks afterwards wondering what in the world had really happened. And so for the longest time, we had these neighbors to the right of us who coincidentally were also a single mom and daughter. There was the daughter, Janine, and the mom, Carla, but unlike us, they were like a whole generation older. Janine was just younger than my mom, so maybe late 20s, early 30s, and Carla had to be in her 60s or 70s. I remember her being fairly active when I was much younger, but by the time I turned 9, she'd gotten really sick with something. So sick, in fact, that she spent most of her time in bed. I'd see her out on the porch every now and then, sitting in her wheelchair, but she didn't talk much anymore. She barely even looked over at me whenever I waved to her. It was really sad, seeing her waste away like that and only ever being in that gosh darn chair. But then one night, things got weird. Like really weird. And so, on the night in question, I remember waking up and feeling like I was about to wet the bed, and so I took myself off to the bathroom as quickly and quietly as I could. I did my business, and then thought that I'd get myself a drink of water before heading back to bed. Those summer nights in Arkansas can get pretty stifling sometimes, even up in the hills, so I remember being really parched and having this absolute need for some water. And then as I'm standing in the kitchen, looking out this little window at Janine and Carla's trailer as I'm gulping down a glass full of water, I could have sworn that I saw Carla standing in her bedroom window. And at first I couldn't tell if it was just a trick of the light because we almost never saw her standing up straight like that anymore. Not unless she had the support of something like her chair or the wall or something. But when I raised my arm and waved to her, she waved back. I was happy, really happy in fact. It had been the first time that we'd interacted like that in what felt like months, and I figured that there had to be maybe some improvement in her condition. I remember going back to bed in a very good mood before drifting off to sleep again, and then the next morning, it totally slipped my mind until I was already at school. By the time I got back home again, I guess it wasn't that high on my list of mental priorities because I didn't mention it to Mom then either. It was only the second time it happened that I brought it up with her, and that happened exactly a week later on another Thursday night. It had been a confusing week because Carla hadn't interacted with me during the daytime, and I think I'd seen her maybe 3 or 4 times during that entire whole period. She'd always been sitting out on the porch getting some fresh air, but every time I'd wave, she'd do that same thing of just sort of not even looking at me, like she couldn't, even if she wanted to. I didn't understand why she was being so hot and cold with me. I mean, I knew it was most likely her illness getting her in the daytime. It was just weird that she'd be so active at nighttime after being up all day while being taken care of by her daughter. But then, just like the previous week, I ended up waking up during the night, not to go to the bathroom, but for a glass of water. And then as I'm looking out the window again, there she was again. We went through the same ritual. I waved at first, and then she waved back. Only that time I took the time to look a little harder, and a little longer too. I couldn't see Carla's face, but I also couldn't tell if that was because no light was actually catching it, or she had her neck down so she was looking at the floor and all her hair was covering her face. I remember getting really creeped out at that second thought for a second, but I soon calmed down because how could she know that I was waving unless she could see me? I tested it out, gave her a second wave, and when she returned it, I figured that I just freaked myself out a little bit. Of course she could see me, I was just being silly, and I still went to bed feeling a little bit creeped out while wondering exactly what was wrong with that poor, sweet old woman. Now, the next morning, I brought it up with Mom at breakfast and told her Carla had been waving to me from her bedroom window. I was about to ask if she knew what was wrong with her and why she might be all active and looking out the window at night. At first, Mom asked, "What did you say?" Like I somehow confused her. And then when I confirmed, I remembered her looking almost sorry as she basically told me, "Oh, honey, you didn't see Carla. That must have been Janine." I was sure it was Janine. I saw Carla's skinny arms. It was Carla's bedroom I was looking at, and I saw the same nightdress that she was wearing in the daytime, too. All parts that were lit up from the outside, I just couldn't see her face. I remember insisting to my mom that yes, it was definitely Carla, and then after she just sighed, she told me why that could not have been Carla waving to me from the window. You see, her condition had worsened to the point where she couldn't get out of bed. She was only awake for a few hours a day, and when she was, it was only ever in the daytime, and she was way too weak to do anything but just lie there and talk. I hadn't been out of bed in weeks by the time I thought I saw her, so there was no way in hell that she could have just stood there by her bedroom window at night, waving at me. I knew better than to argue. Mom never was one for back-talking. But I also knew it in my heart of hearts, even though I was only 9 years old at the time, how that must have been Carla I was looking at, not Janine. It only happened once more, as in sort of I only saw Carla in the window at night one more time, and on that occasion, I didn't bother waving to her. I was just too creeped out. I thought about yelling for my mom, but I also knew that if I did, fate would make it so Carla disappeared from the window and would make it look like I was just making stuff up. I even tried it out too. I walked back to my room and then crept into the kitchen and looked to the window, and then what do you know? Carla was gone again. Like it was her trying to cause trouble by, I guess you might these days say, gaslighting me. I still hoped that she was getting better, even if people said she wasn't, but in reality, Carla wasn't long for this world. I remember seeing a minister and assistant stop by one day, driving this big fancy sedan, well, fancy to me anyway, and they stopped by Janine and Carla's place, and I remember asking my mom why. She told me that Carla probably wanted to get right with God before her time came, and how that's what sick people do sometimes when they're close to the end. I believed it at the time, but nowadays, I think differently about that visit. Lots of strange things happen in the Ozarks, especially in the darker, less traveled areas of the mountains. It's not uncommon for people to seek the help of the church when their loved ones are really sick or acting strange, and while I don't know exactly what that minister did, I know a couple of days later, Carla passed away. Me and Mom went to her funeral, and I remember people expressing almost this sort of feeling of relief. Relief that Carla was no longer suffering from whatever illness it was. But looking back on it, I'm not sure it was an illness, at least not in the conventional sense. I just hope that whatever that minister did, it brought her everlasting peace. I've been a journalist all my life. I can't say I've worked anywhere particularly prestigious, but I made a living mostly through sports journalism. I've met some fine people in that time, some I remember well, and some that are beginning to slip my mind as the years go by. But out of all of them, there's one man whose name I'll never, ever forget, and that's a guy by the name of Chris Woods. Chris was a veteran of the Country Gazette that I worked at back when I was still just a pup, and he was held in such high regard that he worked GA, or General Assignment. Now, that's when a journalist is trusted to pick their own subjects, usually on account of their impeccable nose for a story, and so you can imagine how skilled Chris was, how much we all looked up to him, and how devastated we all were when he suddenly passed away one winter. His car was found parked up on the War Eagle Bridge with a note on the driver's seat explaining how there had been a diagnosis and how he was too tired to fight it. People were shocked. Some respected his right to choose, but others didn't and said that he should have fought. But to my eternal shame, I didn't have the heart to tell them that none of it was true. You see, the night before he passed, Chris came to me with one of those big old brown envelopes in his hand, A4 size. He told me he was going to meet with someone, and that if the meeting was successful, he'd be on his way to writing the biggest and most important story of his entire career. He was working under an assumed identity, and while that sounds unethical, trust me when I say that it was very common journalistic practice, probably even more so these days. Chris thought that he had all of his bases covered and had his mark completely fooled, but he also told me that he had this creeping sense of doubt about the whole thing. When I told him if he had his doubts he should call off the meeting, he said he couldn't. He said he was in too deep and that the rewards were too high and that if he didn't show, he might spend the rest of his entire life wondering about what could have been. But if anything did happen to him, I was to give the envelope to a buddy of his who worked over at a paper a city over, because inside were all the notes, audio recordings, and photographs he'd collected during his investigation into the Cave Creek Baptist Church. Chris first mentioned the church about 6 months prior after a weekend spent visiting his elderly mom. She still lived in the house that he grew up in, way out in a little town called Mount Judea. I've driven through there once or twice, and it's a pretty little farm town set in the middle of a wide valley. Chris used to go down there to spend the whole weekend with her sometimes and said there were 2 things that she always made him do, without fail: peel potatoes and go to church with her on Sunday mornings before he drove back. Chris said that they went to the same church all their lives, and then one day, out of the blue, his mom says the girls from her bridge club had all started going to this place out near Cave Creek, and how it's undergone a beautiful renovation after a sizable anonymous donation. Now, I remember Chris saying how it sounded like good news at first. It's not often some old rural church falls into disrepair only to be saved by some wealthy benefactor whose granddaddy had been baptized there or something. So, being only too happy to see the church in all its newfound glory, Chris drove his mom over to the creek and laid eyes on the church there for the very first time. And boy, did he take a lot of notes on it. I had to go through my old copy of the files that he gave me to get all this right, but these were all the things he noted. Most rural churches have floors made of concrete, wood, or carpet, but Cave Creek Baptist had marble. Chris's mom said it was one of her friend's nephews who got the contract for the floor, and that he earned himself a very generous paycheck installing underfloor heating. The church's new sound system was equally impressive. Chris said that he used to review rock and roll shows down in Little Rock for one of the papers there, saying they were some of his favorite assignments. And that's how he got interested in concert setups, and how he recognized that Cave Creek Baptist was now complete with top-of-the-line speakers, sophisticated baffles, a digital mixing console, and even wireless microphones for those who stood at the pulpit. Outside, they had hand-laid stonework on the foundations and steps, and a paved parking lot with LED lighting and security posts. The landscaping included an irrigation system along with these beautiful specimen trees that looked like they were transplanted from a botanical garden. A whole extra structure had been built on the side, something they called a fellowship hall. Chris didn't get to look all the way inside, but from a window he saw a professional-grade kitchen with quartz countertops, along with commercial-grade refrigeration, which included a wine fridge. But the thing that really got Chris's attention were the security features. His notes said that they were, quote, high-end but low-profile that doesn't match the trust in the Lord vibe. And he also recognized the cameras, which were neatly integrated into the architecture, as in having night vision and motion tracking features. They also have commercial-grade locks on reinforced doors and a silent alarm system that was tied to a private monitoring service. Chris is making a note of all this stuff in his head while the pastor's giving his service, and you might be thinking that he was a real likable guy to be the recipient of all that money. But you'd be wrong on that, because Chris was a great judge of character and said the guy gave off a subtle but very distinct flavor of slime ball. His mom ended up introducing him to the guy after the service was over, and Chris said that he got that exact same read off of him. He might have had his own congregation fooled, taking all that high and mighty talk in his beautiful new church, but Chris said that he could see right through him. Something was going on with that church, and Chris wanted to find out what it was. That week, after he got back from his mom's, was the first time he mentioned it to me. We were in the office taking our lunch break when he asked if I was familiar with the Cave Creek Baptist Church out near Mount Judea. Now, I didn't know the area at all back then, so he started telling me about the church and how strange it was that this little old place in the middle of the Ozarks seemed to be so flush with cash. I remember sarcastically saying that he should get to the bottom of things because that evil pastor was no doubt bumping off his elderly congregation after rewriting their wills. And Chris laughed, and I thought that that was the end of it. But then maybe a week later, he was reading a book over lunch, this dusty old local history book titled Old Churches of Newton County. It was my turn to laugh as I told him to drop it already, that he had better things to do than get all paranoid about some lucky pastor getting himself a generous donation. But Chris always did know when he was on to something, and that old church was no different. Now, he kept on visiting his mom on the weekends just as an excuse to hang around the church without showing up in a professional capacity and ruffling feathers. He went maybe 4 or 5 weeks in a row, watching the whole time, figuring out who was an associate or an assistant. And then slowly but surely, he figured out that the one guy's job title was just head of security. He could understand why the place needed a security guard, but apparently, Cave Creek Baptist had a whole team. Again, this didn't seem all that strange, as I can think of 1 or 2 around these parts who wouldn't think twice about robbing a church. But if that was the case, why was the head I mentioned, a man named in Chris's notes as Danvers, hardly ever around the church? I mean, he came and went from time to time, but Chris only ever figured out just how frequently after he tailed him on and off for a couple of days. It was a real risky move, following a guy like that, but Chris was old and wise enough to make sure that his times and places were all near perfect. With a little bit of luck, he figured out Danvers was making regular trips down to Hot Springs for some reason. Now, he felt like he was pushing his luck at one point, having followed him at a distance for 3 out of 5 days. So he borrowed his wife's Altima, worked out Danvers' routine, then followed him all the way down to Hot Springs to see where he was going. He said he almost got himself made when Danvers stopped for some coffee someplace, but thankfully, the place was crowded enough for him to blend in, then make his way out again without being spotted. Chris then almost lost Danvers' car when a spotlight cut him off, but after driving around block by block looking for his car, he found it outside a nightclub owned by a very shady character. Now, the club down in Hot Springs was owned by a man named Ricky Marshall. The name won't mean much to most people, but Ricky was the son of Art Marshall, who ran with a gangster named Oni Madden back in the late 50s and early 60s, back when Hot Springs was a haven for East Coast gangsters looking to start afresh someplace. Ricky might have been a part-time pimp and full-time screw-up, but nightclubs pretty much run themselves if you got the right bartenders, so there were no surprises that he'd settled into managing a club. But there was no way he was doing it all without the blessing of his uncle, Art's younger brother, who by then was the head of the local underworld there. But what business did a rural Ozark church have with a nightclub run by a former pimp? Chris didn't get any clue to that little conundrum until he got back to Fayetteville and was able to do some serious research on Ricky Marshall. That's how he discovered that not only did Ricky have convictions related to prostitution, he also had them for transporting minors across state lines for the purposes of said prostitution and for distributing extreme exploitative material. And this added a whole other dimension to the story because while it was obvious that Danvers wasn't transporting prostitutes either to or from the club, there was some kind of other exchange going on. Yet while the pastor up at Cave Creek seemed like a creepy son of a bitch, it didn't make sense that he was taking large weekly deliveries of magazines or whatever it was. No, there had to be money in the case Danvers carried out with him. The only question was, what was the church giving them in return for it? Chris obviously did his due diligence and made sure that Danvers was actually inside the club and not the late-night Chinese place next door. But just as predicted, after waiting and risking a parking ticket for a few minutes, he watched Danvers walk out of the club with one of those fireproof money cases, which back then must have cost him about $500. Chris had no doubt that this thing was full of cash, or if not, some other kind of material that was so valuable it needed to be able to survive a fire. And no matter how much a person might value that stuff, paper lewd adult images just doesn't realistically fall under that category. Chris then followed Danvers as far as he needed to be sure that he was headed back to the church, and then on the narrow assumption that he was dropping the cash off there, we have to ask ourselves why a house of God was getting cash from a pimp like Ricky Marshall. After tailing Danvers, Chris stopped going to Cave Creek with his mom, and whenever he was visiting her, insisted that they visit the old Mount Judea church instead. He told her it reminded him of being a kid and of happier times, but really he just needed to put enough time and space between himself and Cave Creek Baptist to put the next phase of his plan into action, and that involved approaching Danvers with what amounted to an offer of fake business. Chris waited until he wouldn't be recognized, which also involved the very old-school technique of growing out his beard and investing in a dark pair of sunglasses. Then, after dressing in a way that he was sure Danvers wouldn't recognize him at all, he waited in Hot Springs for him and then made his approach. Chris convinced Danvers he represented an organization similar to the one Ricky Marshall was a part of, and one that was very interested in procuring the product he was providing. I guess it wasn't Chris's first rodeo either, because he took Danvers all the way from "Get lost, buddy, I don't know what you're talking about," to admitting he could bring a sample if Chris could actually compensate him. Chris said he played his hand just right and that he never once mentioned what that product might be, which implied that A, he already knew what it was, and B, that he was so on the level that he knew to mention it out loud in public. Danvers still seemed a little skeptical, even after Chris invited him to pat him down for wires and what have you, but after promising him a sizable finder's fee for sourcing materials for him, Danvers relented and gave Chris a number to call in exactly 24 hours in order to confirm the sample exchange. Chris waited, called the numbers, and then confirmed a time and place for them to meet. And then 2 days later, he was at a desk at the end of the day giving me instructions on what to do with the envelope full of notes and evidence. I didn't take him all that seriously at the time because over the course of maybe a month or two, he'd gone from mentioning his suspicions to reading that old history book to acting like he was about to expose the truth behind the JFK assassination. I thought he'd gone a little nuts, if I'm being honest, that maybe he was going through some kind of midlife crisis. He seemed fixated on something that had a perfectly rational explanation, at least that's what I thought, until I read what was in the envelope. And only then did I realize the gravity of the situation and how Chris's death was not what it appeared to be. I remembered the day that he failed to show up for work in the morning and how people were walking around the office saying, "It must have been one heck of a head cold to not call in and let us know." People treated it like it was no big deal, but I got an actual chill running through me thinking about all the stuff that he'd said about him disappearing and what I should do if he did. Like I said, I thought Chris was losing his mind and that he talked himself into thinking he was the star in his very own conspiracy movie, but he hadn't talked himself into anything, at least nothing delusional anyway. Or maybe a better way to phrase it would be, Chris actually had talked himself into something, and that something was a whole heap of trouble. I had to keep my mouth shut during the unsuccessful search for his body and during his funeral when heartbroken family members were asking why. Why would he do something like that to himself? And in my mind, I kept screaming out, He didn't write that note. He was murdered. But I was also under strict instruction not to kick up a stink about what I'd been told. If I did, I might spook Danvers, the pastor, maybe even the whole operation, and then Chris's work would never be completed. And so instead, I did as I was told, and delivered the files to his friend at the Fayetteville newspaper. I couldn't deliver it to him in person, of course. They didn't just let me walk up to the guy's office and drop it on his desk. I had to go through a secretary. But I left her my contact details and asked her to pass on a message to Chris's friend saying if I could help in any way at all he needed to do was call me. But he didn't, and it got to the point where I had to call him, hounding that secretary again and again until he finally agreed to call me back. But I know now that I shouldn't have put all my hopes in that return call because when it came, they were brutally cut down. When the guy called back, it was like he also thought that Chris was just losing his mind, and while I'd once believed that was the case myself, I couldn't after I read through those files. I asked the guy if he'd read through everything, and when he told me yes, I asked how the hell he could be so dismissive when Chris was so certain of everything. Now, he'd been at Chris's funeral, although I obviously hadn't recognized him because I had no idea what he looked like, but he'd been there as his family grieved, as the official story was circulated among friends and relatives who wept for their dearly departed old friend, and apparently he'd swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. But that's just the thing. I don't believe for a single second that Chris's old journalist buddy read through all those notes and all that evidence and still thought, "Fool's lost his marbles." He read through the same thing I did, so if you ask me, it was more a case of him recognizing how dangerous Chris's work was than refusing to continue it out of fear that he'd suffer the same fate. In a way, I can't blame the guy. I myself was scared as hell driving over to Mount Judea and then on to Cave Creek and the big extravagant church there. I talked to the pastor myself and got the same subtly creepy vibes that Chris did. I mean, I was definitely influenced by the things he'd written in his notes, but he was right, and it felt to me like the guy was wearing a mask of decency. The pastor said that he'd heard about Chris's passing and then invited me into his office to show me something. I didn't know what to expect, but when I saw Chris's photo hanging there on the wall in a fancy golden frame, it made me sick to my stomach. It was a trophy. They had a goddamn trophy of someone that they were complicit in silencing. And the pastor said the church, meaning him, liked to think of Chris as one of his own, since he was someone who'd frequently worshiped with them at one stage and someone who had now gone back to God. The self-satisfied way that he said it turned my stomach too, as if he were saying, "We got your friend, and there's nothing you can do about it." I might have mentioned this already, but just in case I didn't, I made a copy of Chris's envelope before I took it over to his friend. Well, I ended up making 2 more whole copies, one sent to the feds and one I sent to the local sheriff's department. I don't know why I bothered sending it to the county sheriff, who said that the church had more grounds for a harassment case than Chris did for any kind of corruption or other scandal. The feds didn't even call me back, and I'm guessing Chris's work will stay buried in some pile somewhere until some poor schmuck finally gets around to reading it in maybe 30 goddamn years. I thought about driving out there at night and burning the place down myself, provided Danvers or one of his boys didn't shoot me first, but then one day, it burned down all on its own. I guess someone at the Fed finally got around to reading the file, and that someone at the local sheriff's department tipped them off that the crap was about to hit the fan. The pastor vanished along with everyone that was employed there. There was one local man who tended to the church's landscaping, but he didn't know much, and to him, it was just a case of his very cushy job disappearing overnight. Now, I don't know if it was Ricky Marshall and his boys who burned the place down. Maybe Danvers did it on the pastor's instruction. All I know is that Chris tried his damnedest to work out what kind of evil had corrupted that place, all in aid of putting a stop to it, and he paid for it with his life. I was born and raised in the southern Ozarks and spent the majority of it living up in small mountain towns. My best friend growing up was a guy I'll call Tom Tom, or just Tom because he ended up playing drums in the high school metal band that we put together back in 1991. Our guitarist was a guy we called Wizard, because he was so goddamn good that black magic just seemed like the only explanation. I was the lead singer, or more like the lead shouter, and then on bass we had a dude we called Ripper, or just Rip for short, and Rip was crazy. He was loud, wild, and didn't even play bass when he first joined the band, but he had this intensity and vision about him that was second to none. It wasn't even like he could write songs either, but the ideas that he had for them and the stuff that he came up with lyrically, it blew our minds at 18 years old. And there was one line that he wrote that went something sort of like, "Nuclear fire, funeral pyre, bathing the ruins in poison dust." And that had me and Tom both like, dude, that is awesome. And then even though he had this really rough, kind of amateurish art style, the stuff he drew for potential EP and album covers was just incredible. I'm talking like the kind of stuff that you might expect a patient in a mental asylum to draw, but cool. Like outsider art, if you know what that is. Now anyways, Rip had all the vision, and I did an okay job of shouting his lyrics in a way that did them justice, but it was Tom and the Wizard who made the music really pop. Wizard was a legitimately talented guitarist, and since he played a lot of super complicated jazz guitar, he could learn whatever ultra gnarly solos we needed him to. He also understood music, like he could read sheet music and knew which notes and chords we needed to play to make something sound a particular way. And then since all we wanted was to sound scary and heavy, the Wizard helped make that happen in a big, badass way. We wanted to get good, really bad and really fast, so we put in the hours, day after day, practicing at this abandoned cabin in a place that we called the Dog Patch that we converted into a semi-soundproofed practice space. Now, I don't want to say exactly where the Dog Patch was because this is a snake that I don't want to wake, you know what I'm saying? But it's also a story that's too crazy not to tell, so let's just say the Dog Patch was out in the Ozark Mountains someplace, in a spot where so few people lived that we'd actually play heavy metal all night, volume all the way up, and not have to worry about the cops. Now, we started out slow, learning a couple of the slower ex-hoarder songs from Slaughter in the Vatican, but as we got better and better, and the songs got tighter and tighter, it was like we unlocked something collectively, and that's when things really started to pop. We practiced a lot, and we got good, but there was an arrogance about us too. A swagger that said, of course we're good. We work hard at this stuff, and we're going to show the whole damned world just how good we really are. Now spoilers, we didn't end up showing the whole world this. But we did end up showing about 24 venues in some of the bigger towns and cities in northern Arkansas, and let me tell you, that became like a drug after about 3 or 4 of them. We went to kick ass and take names and did both. The ass kicking in the form of tight, gut-punching sets, and the taking names in the form of meeting other bands, swapping numbers, and securing invites to play more venues. And by the time things went to crap, we had a small following coming to each of our shows and asking when we were going to show up with tapes or merch to sell. We were well on our way, dude, I'm sure of it, and then slowly but surely, things started to unravel and fall apart. About a year into practicing and playing shows, Rip got majorly into getting high. Now, we were all getting high, and we did a lot of drinking too, mostly together, but it was a case of, if it's around, cool, I'll try it. But Rip, he'd go on whole trips in the van to different cities looking to buy mushrooms or LSD, or even coke when he had the money. He said he got bigger and better ideas whenever he was high, and we believed it too. I now think his ideas would have been, and were, just as good without getting high, but at the time, we were in the thick of it, you know? Rip had this idea that, to reach the next level, we had to go on a joint LSD trip together, like as a band. Now, I thought it was a great idea, and so did Tom. Wizard said he was down too, but when the day came around, before we all drove down to the Dog Patch to drop acid and jam out, the Wizard dropped out instead. He called Tom to say that he wouldn't be able to make it, and Tom passed the message on to me and Rip, but when Rip heard, he was pissed. We had to spend like a whole hour getting him to chill out again or risk a bad trip with all of his negative energy, and then finally, we took our tabs, sat around at the Dog Patch, and tripped ourselves into oblivion. And the crazy thing about it? It kind of worked. Me, Rip, and Tom actually did feel more like connected afterwards. I wouldn't say it improved our playing or anything. I guess it was more just the sense of brotherhood that we felt after going on our first trip together. But it really did feel like it had made a difference in terms of aligning our visions for the band. I was bummed that Wizard wasn't there to experience it with us and to see what riffs or licks he came up with while tripping, but Rip said that he'd have a talk with him, and have a talk with him, I guess he did. He called me one night saying everything had been arranged and that he and Wizard were going to trip together at the dog patch, and I was obviously very happy about this, but then immediately disappointed when Rip said that they had to do it alone. I think he might have been BSing me looking back on it, but he said that he only had 2 tabs left and that it'd all go much smoother if it was just him and Wizard. It made sense to me at the time, but even if it didn't, Rip said that he had only 2 tabs and couldn't exactly go calling him a liar now. So I think about a week went by, then Rip calls Tom and me to tell us to stay away from the dog patch, at least until later that night because he and Wizard were going on their trip together. Now I'm thinking, cool, okay, see you later maybe, then walk over to Tom's place to hang out and listen to some tunes. It was always a good hang with Tom, but then by about 8 in the evening, we were bored out of our minds and we were itching to practice. Now, I'm not kidding when I say that we used to practice almost every single day, especially once high school ended and we had all this free time on our hands. And so going the whole day without jamming out just made me sort of itchy, you know? And we knew not to drive over to the dog patch not until Rip was done bringing Wizard into quote-unquote alignment. But as 10 p.m. ticked over to 11 and our boredom levels peaked, me and Tom told ourselves that Rip's little ceremony just had to be over by then, and we made our way over to the patch. I remember rolling up, seeing Wizard's car and a light on inside, and then hearing the slightly muted sound of Rip playing his bass on the other side of the cabin wall. We didn't hear Wizard playing at all, but that didn't set off any alarm bells for either of us. And so off me and Tom went, grinning like idiots thinking that we were about to walk in on some clown show, only to walk into a nightmare. We recognized something was wrong right away because Rip was sitting shirtless near his amp, while Wizard's guitar was just laying there, face down on the floor. The guitar meant absolutely everything to him, and even if he was out there tripping balls, there's no way that he'd have just left it lying there unless something was wrong. I started asking Rip where the hell he was, but Rip didn't reply. He didn't even look up from playing that weird, distorted bass line over and over, not until we got really close and started waving our hands right in his face. But by the time we were that close, both me and Tom could also see all these little flecks of blood on his chest and arms. We say, "Dude, what the hell happened to you?" But then that led back to the question of where the hell Wizard was. Rip wouldn't stop playing his bass as he looked up at us, and when he did, we could see how his pupils were sort of like these big black circles from where he was clearly still tripping pretty hard. We're telling him to stop playing and talk to us, but he had his amp turned up so high that I could barely hear myself over the sound of it. Tom had to walk around the back of him and switch off Rip's amp just so I could be heard, by which point I'm getting pretty mad and I'm yelling at him saying, "Where the F is Wizard?" After telling me to chill, Rip said, "Wizard's not here, man," and then started laughing. I guess because he was doing the old Cheech and Chong bit, but then knowing what I know now, it just feels way, way darker. Tom then says, "His effing car's outside, Rip. Where did he go?" But this only caused Rip to start laughing again. He could barely get his words out from laughing so hard, and when he did, they barely made sense. "He didn't go anywhere. He's just not here anymore. He wouldn't give it all up." It was that last part which really got my attention, and I started asking him what he meant by "give it all up." To my frustration, Rip just started laughing hysterically again and not being able to get his words out. And as I'm telling him to breathe and focus, Tom walked out the back door having noticed it wasn't closed all the way, and then not even a minute later, I hear him screaming. I went running out the back door because I'd never heard Tom make a noise like that, not in all the time I'd known him, and I think just from the sound alone I could tell that he'd found Wizard. I caught a glimpse of Wizard's shirtless body and how he was lying face down in the dirt outside the cabin, with his back smeared with blood. There was a lot of it too, blood I mean, and so much that I also thought that he was dead. And that's what Tom kept saying as he pushed me back towards the cabin. He'd said I didn't want to see it, that Wizard was gone, and that there was no helping him. I told him we needed to go get help. I guess because I couldn't accept what he was telling me, but when he told me about Wizard's head being cracked open and that we needed to get the hell out of there before Rip did the same to us, it flipped a switch in my mind. I first thought that maybe it had been an accident or something. The Wizard had fallen and smacked his head on a rock while he had been out tripping, and Rip was just too high to even realize or handle it. And Tom had seen the body up close. He'd seen the damage done, and from his perspective, there wasn't anything accidental about them. The next thing, I was back in the cabin yelling, "What the F did you do?" as Tom just kept on pushing me towards his car. He was growling at me to shut up and move, and behind him, Rip was still sitting on his butt with his base across him, smiling as I yelled at him. He wasn't laughing then, though. Smiling, sure, but not laughing, and he was calmly explaining that Wizard couldn't commit, and he had to go. I remember him saying something about another band and how Wizard couldn't make the first acid trip because he was playing with another band someplace. Then in this big, booming voice, Rip called him a traitor and told us we knew what happened to traitors. He then launched into some rant about loyalty, but I didn't catch it, because by then, Tom had managed to wrangle me outside. Rip continued to rant and rave as Tom continued to force me towards his car, but by then, Rip's voice was all muffled and barely audible. I guess it was only then that I tuned back into Tom and heard him telling me, "Get in the car, dude. We need to get ready to move." I could not have agreed more because we needed to find some place to call 911, but that's not what Tom had in mind at all, because after I'd climbed into his passenger seat and he climbed in beside me, he didn't start the engine. Instead, he reached across me, opened up his glove box, and pulled out a gun. Now, it might sound messed up, but at the time, I kinda got it. I didn't think that Tom was that mad about what Rip had done. I mean, I knew he was mad, but I thought it was more of a sort of, we need to go get this son of a bitch in cuffs before he runs off. But when he said, we need to get out of here, I guess it was because he was planning on committing a murder of his own. And honestly, I understood his thinking, which is why I didn't try to stop him at first. When I realized that if he did shoot Rip, if he walked in there and blew his head off like he deserved, then all 3 of my bandmates would have their lives cut short, and not just 2. The last thing I wanted was for Tom to go to jail for the rest of his life, so after those first few moments of asking, "What are you doing?" but knowing exactly what he was doing, I switched to, "Tom, don't do it. He's not worth it, man." But I couldn't even sell that last part to myself because I didn't believe it. Rip deserved to die for what he did, and I didn't know if I had it in me to stand in front of the bullet. I followed him out of the car just as Rip appeared in the open doorway of the cabin with a big smile still plastered across his mouth. I was still yelling at Tom not to do it, and he already had the gun pointed right at Rip's head, but you'd never have guessed it from Rip's reaction alone. He had his arms stretched out either side of him like he was inviting Tom to shoot him, and he was saying a whole bunch of stuff at the same time, but the thing that stood out was when he said something like, "If you honestly think I deserve to die for it, then go ahead, shoot me." Tom walked right up to him. I mean, so close that he was like pushing the gun against the space between his top lip and his nostrils. And then he stopped and didn't shoot. I remember thinking something to the effect of, "Oh, thank God," because the last thing we needed was another dead body out there. I thought Tom was just going to yell at him because he started screaming all of these curses at him, like he was just going off on everyone he could think of all at once. I thought he was letting off some steam, or maybe about to pistol whip him, but then, bang. Tom shot Rip right through the mouth, and at least from where I was standing, it killed him instantly. Seeing Rip go down like that, the way he did, and knowing Tom had just pissed his life away killing someone the cops probably would have shot anyway, it hit hard, man. I remember spinning away with my head in my hands, saying, "No, no, no," over and over. I didn't want to look because I couldn't accept it. And then when Tom started yelling at me to get in the car, I couldn't bring myself to do it at first. I kept saying how if I did, we were all going to jail, because that'd make me probably an accessory. But then I also realized that if I didn't get a ride someplace, I'd have to walk there to get help, because there was still the voice in the back of my head thinking, maybe they're still alive. We drove until I saw a house with a light on, then demanding he stop. I knew it might be the last time I ever saw him, but we didn't have the luxury of some long, drawn-out goodbye. At the very least, I needed to somehow prove I wasn't involved in all the killing by being the poor bastard to call it in. But like I said, there was still this semi-delusional part of me that thought that I could save the day. I'm glad I followed that instinct. And my wife says it was God speaking through me because he knew all too well that Rip and Wizard weren't quite in his company yet. I used a stranger's phone to direct the EMTs out to where they were, and by some stroke of God's hand, those paramedics discovered them both and that they were still alive. Both Rip and Wizard were rushed to the hospital, Wizard with extensive head injuries and Rip with a big hole through his cheek and jaw from where the bullet Tom fired smashed through his teeth and out the other side without damaging anything major somehow. Both went into surgery that same night, and both came out okay, albeit with very different paths to recovery. Wizard obviously came off way worse, and after having his skull clamped shut with metal staples, he spent a whole year learning to walk and talk again. He also had to relearn how to play guitar, which was messed up on a whole other level. Now, he said he could remember how to play all the stuff he used to, but it was like his hands had forgotten. It said it made him feel like his brain had been translated into another body or something, like it was really freaky like that, and he had all the support of his friends and family too, and Wizard was a popular guy, whereas Rip, he didn't have much in the way of family, and after people heard about what he did, no one wanted to associate themselves with him. He ended up living with expensive scarring on both sides of his face, and after he recovered from his surgery, he was put on trial for attempted murder, pled guilty, and ended up going to prison for just over 10 years. I heard he got into the logging industry and probably had guys wondering how the heck he got those scars, but whether or not he told them the truth or told them at all, that's a question I don't have the answer to. I never did see him again, and I never saw Tom again either. My guess is he left the country thinking he'd killed Rip and fearing the death penalty since the state restarted executing people just a year or two prior. We actually wrote a song about it since the method they used was lethal injection. Tom thought it was cool because the concept scared the crap out of him, so when faced with the prospect for real, I don't blame him for swapping Tom for El Tomo Tomo, if you know what I'm saying. And the only person I kept in touch with, who I'm still in touch with, is Wizard. He moved out to California to try and make it big playing guitar, and while in many respects he achieved his dream, he realized the touring schedules and the lifestyle just wasn't for him. He switched to being a session musician and tutoring kids on the side, and then since he found it so rewarding, he switched to tutoring full-time and ended up making enough to support his wife and 2 kids of his own. Now, it's nice to think that he's doing okay, but sometimes I feel like I'd do just about anything to know how Tom's doing, and it makes me sad to think that these days I might pass my best friend from childhood in a busy street and not know him from Adam. So Tom, if you just so happen to hear this, reach out, buddy. I miss you. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel that I know you'll love. It's called Saturn Soul. Go subscribe right now, for God's sakes. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, shampoo and condition your bush.